Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Journey of Development. Our topic today is empowering employees to learn. The format for our event will allow each panelist to share their unique perspective on their experience with inspiring continued growth and development of employees through their current position and or upward movement throughout the company. Before we start with our panelists, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Nicole with Pryor Learning Solutions. As a continuous learner, I feel engaged and empowered learning from the experience and wisdom of my network, as well as sharing my experience gained through my nearly 20 years in sales, marketing, and operations management. The Journey of Development events is a way for me to continue my own personal development and support others with their development and growth. Through Pryor, I work as a consultant to organizations to improve communication, collaboration, and culture across all levels of the organization through customized programs designed specifically to meet that organization's strategic goals. Today we have Amy Frederick, a learning and talent development professional to highlight. She's seeking her next career challenge. If you are aware of something within your organization, or if you're aware of somebody in the marketplace that is looking for someone new that would speak well to her, please let us know. Amy is looking for something in the Chicagoland area. She's also open to remote positions. She's open to the industry. She has 16 years of experience across learning and talent development, program development and management, project and change management, large conference organization, and leadership development. Our first panelist today is Jim. Jim is now the Vice President of Human Resources for Safe Federal Credit Union, a credit union of over $1 billion in assets with 20 branches in the Midlands of South Carolina. Jim has a long HR career. Because he is old, I didn't write this, he did, in a number of industries and companies, including Xerox, United Technologies, Tenneco, and Coleman. He has been a corporate gypsy, with his 12th geographical move, including a couple of years in Switzerland as an expatriate. Since his early days with Xerox, Jim's stated passion or goal was to help organizations and individuals grow and reach their potential. He has maintained that personal mission throughout his career. With that, Jim, are you ready to go?
I am. Welcome, everybody. I'm sure I'm probably speaking to some people that in some cases probably know more than I do, but I wanted to take the opportunity, and Nicole asked to go ahead and at least share a few thoughts. So I will try to move fairly quickly in interest of time, but I understand we do have some time for questions and stuff at the end. So you can hit the next one. So thank you. I'm going to just hit kind of talk to four different areas, I guess, as it relates to learning. Again, who is responsible, and making sure that that is understood, I guess, by everybody from a career development standpoint. What, at least from my perspective, has changed over the years. What are some of the different tools and resources that at least I see and I see people using along the way, and then how to make sure that we get the appropriate people to kind of gain ownership for their responsibility. Next slide. In terms of who is responsible, next slide, Nicole. That's good. Hello, there we go. This is just, I copied a portion out of what I have as an individual development plan, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but I think the important point on this one is, at least what I have seen over the years is, I think it's clear that you got to make sure that the individual themselves understand that they're responsible for their career or career development. I think a number of individuals, or at least I think a fair segment of the population, like to try to lay it on the organization, lay it on their career, lay it on their manager in terms of responsibilities. And that I've focused on and made sure that everybody understood is that it is your responsibility. Yes, the manager does have some responsibility to help you, to coach you, to open doors if necessary, and certainly the organization has a responsibility to help you as it relates to information and potentially learning opportunities and tools, but the individual is the one that has to take ownership for that, and I don't think I can overemphasize that with people. Next, in terms of at least some thoughts on what I think has changed over the years, And one, I think, is just in terms of organizations, it's next slide, Nicole. The speed and the frequency of change that I think we all see inside of our organizations. No organization can stand still now. Interestingly enough, the organization that I'm currently with has kind of lived in a world where they haven't had to move very quickly. They've been very successful, but now we're in a different kind of level and we need to pick up the pace in terms of change. And I think we're a little bit behind in having to catch up, and that's a bit of a paradigm shift for a lot of people. So I think every organization has to make sure that, and every individual in an organization, I guess, has to make sure that they're changing to be able to kind of keep up with what's going on. Certainly the increase in technology is a contributor to that from a change standpoint, but it's also a terrific contributor in terms of the learning opportunities, and we'll talk about that as well. And that kind of is the next bullet as it relates to the availability of online kinds of different learning alternatives. There's a number of them out there. Years ago, it was, you think of the organizations that are General Electric or Xerox or whatever, where they had huge training centers. And at one time I worked for Xerox, and they would fly in people for a week or 2 weeks at a time, year after year after year, for all instructor-led kinds of classes. And there are a few of those left, but those kinds of opportunities have changed very quickly over the course of the years, and you don't see the same kind of commitment in that regard. There's also, I think, a big need or a desire for just-in-time training. People want to be able to get at the information that they need and they want very, very quickly, as opposed to potentially, again, come into an instructor-led kind of course or whatever. So to be able to get access to information, whether it's technical training or whether it's leadership or skills training, to be able to get at that information and understanding when they need it, I think is certainly a great opportunity for people. And I guess the other comment here I had was just kind of the loyalty of the workforce today. We all know that certainly the number of job changes that individuals have earlier in their career today is different than what we might have seen 20 or 30 years ago. People are not always as loyal to their companies, and the amount of learning or the learning opportunities that we provide can certainly be a big part of helping build in that loyalty, because if we're not providing it for them, generally people will go somewhere where they will be able to get it. Okay, next slide. Resources and tools, I think we all know these. I think we sometimes overemphasize or underemphasize certain ones. I think on-the-job training is still probably where most learning takes place, leveraging peers, leveraging supervisors, coaches, buddies, whatever you may call them in that organization, but make sure that the individuals that have the experience and have the knowledge understand their responsibilities to be sharing that with new employees and individuals as they're growing. Online resources are just tremendous in terms of what's available right now, whether it's the internet or online providers. And that's just, whether you're going out and looking at websites, whether you're listening to webinars like this, whether you're using online training companies like Pryor or Skillsoft or lynda.com, there's just a tremendous number of resources that are out there and available for organizations, and make it much easier for them to be able to deliver that just-in-time training that we talked about. An area that I think some organizations use very well are task groups, improvement teams, project teams, whatever you may call them. It is a great way for people to learn, a great way for individuals to get exposure on areas maybe outside of their day-to-day job. I think we sometimes are guilty in organizations of always going to the same people and asking them to participate in this next new initiative, as opposed to broadening that. And so I think we all need to think about, how we can continue to bring more people in that fold and have them help to be a part of the solution when we're looking at change. Tuition assistance and conferences, those I think exist in most organizations. It's the one piece that I've tried to emphasize in organizations I've been with, if somebody goes off to a seminar or off to a conference, part of their responsibility when they come back is to make sure that they share what they've learned, what they are going to do differently as a result, or what they think the organization or department or whatever the case may be needs to do differently. And I don't think we always do a good job sometimes of closing that loop when we send people off to different seminars or conferences. And I think that's an opportunity that we miss sometimes along the way. Internal mentors and coaches are, again, always a inexpensive, if you will, but valuable tool for people. So formalizing that to some extent where it needs to be is an opportunity. And then again, as we said before, there's books, magazines, associations. You know, I probably get 12 to 15 different, mostly free publications a month, which is an opportunity for me to try to stay current in terms of what's going on and what we're seeing in different organizations. Okay, next slide, please. In order to kind of gain ownership, I guess, I think we need to be candid with our folks in making sure that they understand that even if they want to stay in their own job, the current job that they have, we still have to learn and grow to survive, because as we said before, technology is changing, processes are changing, customer demands are changing, and so sitting still is not really an option. I don't think there are many jobs in many organizations that there isn't a fair amount of change going on literally every year. And so they can't stand still, and that has to be something that they got to learn to manage and take ownership for. Again, as we said before, make sure that the responsibility is understood and that they are in charge of making sure that they are, I guess, growing and learning and doing whatever is necessary. Yep, we need to help them, but it is ultimately their responsibility. And I'll kind of talk about a tool that at least I've used in the past that helps that to some extent. Organizations have to provide the resources and the opportunities, so we do have a responsibility there. We've talked about many of those. So that burden is on our shoulders in terms of making sure we've got that. We need to encourage, ultimately what we're doing if somebody, you know, has aspirations of different jobs or different departments, is the way I usually kind of make sure that people understand it is what you're really trying to do is put yourself in a position where you can better compete for the job. And I oftentimes use the example if a manager is looking to make a hiring decision and he has two individuals that roughly look the same on paper, they for the most part interview about the same. But one of those individuals has clearly done his or her homework as it relates to understanding the job, has taken some courses or things to prepare for that job, maybe has spent time in the department learning more about that job, talking to either the supervisor or a peer in that job, then most likely they're going to get the nod. And so then the question from an employee standpoint is, how do you put yourself in a better position to compete? People think it's politics, but it's more human nature, I think, in that regard. And so you want to make sure you're taking advantage and positioning yourself well. And then again, we have to help them, you know, with the different ways of which we can do it. And what I have at least used in the past, and if you want to go to the next slide, Nicole, is something that I've called an individual development guide, which if anybody's interested, I can send them kind of a generic version of that they could tweak if they want. But this just shows kind of the content. It's got the introduction and the roles, as we talked about before, but an individual goes through a fairly detailed self-analysis. What are their likes? What are their dislikes? What's their rationale? What is their current performance? And that's looking at it at a competency level and the key behaviors that define each competency, because I think you have to get it down to that behavioral level to really do a good job, whether you are evaluating someone's performance or you're looking at it yourself in terms of your own performance. So individuals kind of do that self-analysis, looking at their core competencies, looking at whatever functional competencies they have, and then depending upon what their role is or what their interests are, They may be looking at leadership, management, supervisory kind of competencies as well. First, they come up with a development plan on how they need to get better in their individual role, because we have to perform our current jobs well before we can realistically compete for a new job, because our current manager is most likely going to be a reference for us. And then they go through a similar kind of process looking at future interests and trying to define what are the roles they're interested in, how are they going to get the information that they need, what are the things that they need to do to develop themselves as it relates to being able to, again, better compete for that kind of job, and coming up a very specific development plan as it relates to what is that development that's needed, what are the actions that they're going to take, what assistance, if any, they need from a resource standpoint to help them achieve that particular development need, what's their target completion date, and then they keep up with the status along the way. If somebody is truly interested and wants to go through that kind of process, then they have a pretty good tool, and it also can be a little bit of a marketing piece for them as well as they kind of go forward and actually are trying to interview and or compete for a job in a different department. And with that, I think those are my thoughts for the time being. The next slide, there's an email address if anybody is interested or has any questions. I'll be more than happy to either via email or shoot me a note, a phone number, give you a call, and be happy to share more. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Cynthia Brown. She joined Ruffalo Noel Levitz in 2016 to lead the new Talent Acquisition and Development Division. She has over 15 years of experience in recruiting and training, with the majority of her career spent in the Air Force. During her 25-year military career, she held recruiting roles, taught in the United States Air Force Academy, and was the chief analyst of the Air Force responsible for developing training for AF analysts. Since transitioning to Ruffalo Noel Levitz, Cindy established an HR roadmap to strategically grow the department's competencies. She's working on several training initiatives, including individual development plans, initial competency, and following on training and assessments to quantify learning across the organization. Cynthia, with that, I can leave the poll open, or I can end it if you'd like the results now.
Yeah, if you can go ahead and close the poll so I can get the results, and then if you share so that I can present, that would be awesome. And the poll results.
So the first question, do you have a formal training records that are kept or visible at the corporate training level? 80% of our respondents say yes, we maintain or can see all training records. We have 0% no managers retain these records, and 20% say no, we don't have a formal training records.
Okay.
Do your training records track all training the employees receive, onboarding, on the job, compliance, etc.? Yes, all training is tracked in one training record. That's 20%. It depends. We track all training that is external to the LMS, and managers are supposed to track all other training, 0%. No, only training that is internal to our LMS is tracked, 60%. And 20% say we don't track training.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the poll was because I wanted to compare my experience in the military to other companies out there. Since Ruffalo Noel Levitz is the only company that I've actually worked at, I was trying to figure out how we, kind of related to our peers. And we don't have training records. So that's been one of the things that I really want to work on, and I'll kind of talk to you as I go through my comments. As I said earlier, the reason I wanted to talk about records and training and that kind of thing is, as we all know, we're all learning professionals here. It is so critical to the success of an organization that CEOs talk about it all the time. Jack Welch, obviously a famous CEO, talked about the fact that we need the ability to learn, and that gives us the competitive edge if we can do it quickly. So it's not just about teaching someone a concept. It's the ability to learn all the time. So one of the things, I promise this is the only thing about the Air Force I'm going to talk about, but one of the tenets that we have in the Air Force is something that we call centralized command, decentralized execution. And what that really means is we need at the higher levels to be thinking about the strategy and what we need to do kind of operationally to be successful, but we can't execute at that level. It has to be the lower levels that are executing the plan. So to me, this translates perfectly into the business world and into learning and development, because I feel like your development is centralized, but your learning is decentralized. So organizations really learn at the lowest levels, and you have to be able to trust people at the lower levels while you develop it at the higher levels. And so I think you should even expand this more into the fact that organizations learn through the trust and flexibility of the managers and the employees. And then we, as learning professionals, are sharpening that corporate focus in terms of what we need to be doing to help those managers and employees. But I really feel like as trainers, we need to understand that most of the learning is happening at that lower level. So how do we empower those individuals to either help themselves or help their employees? So I just did, sorry about the jerkiness on this next slide, I just did kind of a little bit of animation. But if we take 3 individuals and they come in, we're going to onboard them. We're going to do some kind of skill assessment to them. We're going to figure out what they need to go into their position based on maybe a skill gap or based on some kind of specialty that we have. And then we're also going to hopefully work on that cultural fit, because it costs, it's the recruiting side of me coming in, right? But it costs so much money to get those professionals. How do we make sure that we really make them part of our team and include them? Well, those 3 individuals, though, can go a bunch of different places. So if we just look at one of them, after we've done this onboarding and we've done some of that initial training, that individual may not work. That individual may exit for whatever reason, either their choice or our choice. But that doesn't mean that that individual wasn't important to our organization and doesn't continue to be important to our organization, because they are going to go out and talk about our company. So we're hopefully going to send that person on the way with positive thoughts about us, and they can go out there and help us with that recruiting cycle again. Now we have other individuals who, yeah, they're really going to like our company. They're going to want to stay with us, and they're going to seek out those development opportunities. They're going to look for new roles. And so we need to encourage those folks. How are they different from that individual that wasn't fitting in? What made us progress them to that next level? Let's help identify some of those things so that we can really look for that in new talent that we have coming in for us. And we're going to grow these people. Now, as Jim said earlier, they're not staying with companies that long. So we can spend a lot of time and money developing this individual, and they're going to go off. Well, this individual, I think, is even more important than that first individual, because they've spent time with us. And whether that be a couple years or whether that be a decade, they should know a lot about our company. And they should really be able to go out there and promote us even if they're not with us anymore. They also might return. So that's one of the things that we found in our industry is we have folks that go off and grow someplace else, and then they come back to us. So we still want to nurture those relationships and have them leave feeling like we cared about them as an individual to continue developing them. And then, of course, we have those other folks that are going to stay with us long-term. And what long-term means is changing, but they may even stay with us so long that they've kind of moved into a role where they're capped, either because they've gotten to the top of their potential, or they're just, they like what they're doing. They don't want to move on. Maybe they have some potential to move on, but they don't want to move on. They want to stay in that current role. And Jim said the same thing. We have to figure out how to motivate those individuals, because from my experiences, you are either developing positively or you're developing negatively. No one is stagnant. So we have to figure out how do we engage those individuals. And then eventually those folks are going to leave either through retirement or they just exit as well. So I can end here because Jim did everything on the individual development plan. Just teasing, Jim. I kind of grayed it out because I don't want you to look at all the details, because the details don't matter, and the structure that we have might not be the right structure for your company. But what I think is important is putting some structure around what I like to call purposeful development. So I love the title that you have for this webinar, because I think it's super important to think of it as a journey, but to think of it as a purposeful journey, because we don't want people kind of making the journey where they want to go. We want it to be where they want to go, but also where we need them to go. And I think it's the manager's responsibility and the leadership's responsibility to help guide them in those directions and find the right fit for them and for us as a company. So what we do here, and again, we are starting all of this. I've been at Ruffalo Noel Levitz for about 1.5 years now. So I started implementing this about 6 months ago, and we're just getting ready to go live now. I know it works because the military has done this for decades. And what I just need to do is figure out how I take that concept and bring it over to a business. And I don't think the concept changes. It's how does it fit into your culture and into the way that you develop your learning. But what we do is every position in the company will have 5 competencies. And then based on those competencies, if we have formal training, we'll put that, because I want to be able to tie everything that we do in the training department back to a job and back to a skill and a competency. Because if we're doing training that doesn't tie to something that's important to the company, then why are we doing it? And so one of the examples that Jim talked about is going off to conferences. I think that we're not good in learning and development of getting that information when they come back from a conference. But I know from my past experiences, we're not good about purposely picking those conferences either. We have individuals that come to us and say, hey, I want to go to this. In fact, we partnered with a community college here, and they would offer like 12 seminars throughout the year, and we would buy a certain number of seats. And in the learning department, we just opened it up to anyone in the company that wanted to go to that. In my mind, that's not a good use of our resources. Yes, those courses may be exactly what we need to do, but we need to target the people that need that. The people that were going to the time management courses were the people that were already awesome at time management. Well, that may have been helpful for that individual, but it would have been a lot more helpful for an individual that was struggling with that particular skill. So that's why I say it's purposeful. And that's what the IDPs help us do. So you take your competencies, you have your skills and your tasks, and then you're going to be evaluated at particular points in time, depending upon when the employee should be competent in that. So when we get new employees, this is really easy, right? Because you say, hey, you came into the company, here's your skill sets. We're going to evaluate them every quarter until we make sure we've done everything we need to do to help you. But if you have someone who's been in a role for a long period of time, they should be able to right away show their proficiency in all of those skills and tasks. So this is then when you actually start kind of changing an individual development plan to do what Jim said, and that's to help them progress. Okay, what's your next step? Where do you want to go? What skills do you find interesting? Let's figure out what that looks like in terms of a career path. And now let's start adding some of those competencies every quarter and get you ready for the next job before you get there. So that's the idea behind it. And not only can you do actual kind of skill-based competencies, but you can also do what I would call the soft skills. And so we're going to do soft skills at the corporate level. These are things that all of our employees really need to be able to do. And then the last piece of it, because I like to try to reuse tools whenever possible, is this assessment of individuals. And the assessment really serves 2 purposes. The first purpose is to, no kidding, help the manager identify areas that that employee might be struggling in, and they need some more training, or, if they're not developing, what do we need to do? What is the next step for that individual? But once you get to that proficient level, and I think this is going to be the part that culturally is hard, based on what I've been seeing in like our performance management evaluations and such, is giving people threes. Your solid performer should be a 3. That's what we need. We don't want to get rid of solid performers. Solid performers are awesome. So everyone should be a 3. But then those individuals that really are exceptional, a step above their peers or an expert on it, if you put that in the assessment, now I can quickly identify people that can help me if I need a SME from some area, or if they're really an expert in multiple areas. That has now helped me identify that high performer, the person that needs to move on, because otherwise they're going to get tired. They're not going to want to stay with the company because they're not being challenged. So it helps me in a multiple of areas. It helps me with the folks that need improvement, but it also helps me with the folks that are excelling and help me identify additional career development opportunities for them. So a quick rundown of that. I just wanted to do a couple takeaways on what I think that purposeful development looks like. The first thing is it takes time. You have to dedicate time to creating those IDPs. You have to dedicate time to being able to address the training. You have to dedicate the time as an individual employee, because we're probably going to be asking you to do things that you don't see the direct connection to what you're doing. I'm not teaching you how to write an RFP, but I'm going to be teaching you skills that help you do that better. The next thing is you have to collaborate on all the levels. So for us to be able to create these IDPs, to make sure that we have the right competencies and that we have the right skills and tasks under those competencies, we need to make sure we're talking to the teams that are doing that work. And it's easy to go to the managers and have the managers make the list, but that's not always the best place. I think you need to have the managers, but you also need to have a couple of your star workers, because they may have steps that the manager doesn't know about. Some kind of system change since the manager was there, and now they have to do all these additional things that are taking away from their ability to accomplish it successfully or whatever. So it's important to collaborate at all the levels to figure out what the right competencies and tasks are that should be included. And then you have to have those periodic reviews, because no job stays the same. And if it is staying the same, we still have to have the periodic reviews to make sure that the people that we're bringing in start off with the same skills. As I said, the IDP in my mind is both a corporate and an individual evolution. So for the corporate side of the house, it's about making sure that we retain the best employees. It's about making sure that we're not spending training dollars in areas that we don't need to spend it in. On the individual side, it's that way to keep the individual motivated, to keep them growing, especially for those folks that have been in their roles for long periods of time that don't have a clear next step. How do we get them additional competencies so that they can have that next step, or at least they continue to feel challenged? I personally feel you need some kind of structure to this. It's not possible to have everyone looking at individual development without relating it to that corporate side. So for instance, we have 20 data folks. They may have 5 managers. How am I making sure, without some structure to it, that all of those managers are assessing their individuals on the same set of skills and using the same kind of scale? So it really depends upon your culture, how structured that is. But I believe that you do have to have some type of structure around your learning and development function to really help make it better. And that goes with the next one, which is the metrics. This is the hardest part, I know. I'm not going to say we're good at this, but you have to have some kind of metrics so that you can show your leadership and get buy-in to, why do we want to take all this extra time? Why do I want to be able to get training that you don't see as directly tying to writing an RFP? Well, here's why. I need to be able to show you. So those are kind of my quick takeaways, and this is everything that I've been talking about, I think, the whole time, is that growth depends upon activity. There's no development physically or intellectually without effort, and that effort means work. And for us, that work is to be able to grow personally. It's that work to be able to grow as an employee, work to grow as a manager, and then work for us to grow the company. This is a lot of work and effort to go into this, but it helps us all develop together, and we're developing, hopefully, in the same and right direction. So I know I speak really fast, but I wanted to try to just show a little bit of what we're trying to do at Ruffalo Noel Levitz, and hopefully help you out just a tiny bit. But just like Jim, I'm able to send examples of what we do for our IDP. I will send my email address right now in the chat box. And I love being able to mentor or talk to other individuals, because I believe that we always get great ideas from everyone. No matter what level we're at, we all have something to offer. So I love to chat and learn from you.
Final panelist is Lisa Jackson. Lisa is CEO and founder of CuturSpire and the Modern Culture Academy, helping companies lead workplaces of purpose, passion, and profit. She has worked with organizations such as GE, Boeing, Xerox, and many entrepreneurial companies seeking to transform and lead change. Ms. Jackson is the author of 2 books on culture, a weekly blog, and is an international keynote speaker on the topic of modern workplace. Her take on culture and the millennial generation will make you think differently. We expect a unique and refreshing perspective from today's session. Lisa, are you ready?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Before I start, and thank you, Nicole, for inviting me, I wanted to just say, there's been a lot of really good information shared by Jim and Cindy about this topic, and I'm I'm sort of a practical person, so my offering here is really about the how-to and a step-by-step approach, more on the empowering side of the equation rather than on the learning side of the equation. I'm not an internal person. I'm an external consultant. I work in the culture realm, and I want to talk a little bit about the subject of empowerment. And I just think it's such a profound topic. It's both personal as well as having implications in business. And what I mean by that is, as human beings, we all want to feel that we have the freedom and the opportunity to be our best selves, to express that, in ways that add value to a conversation, to an endeavor, to a business. And that empowerment thing, I think, is closely connected to the engagement issues that you're seeing in the workplace today, that feeling, you see it especially with the younger generations, of wanting to feel that I can step forward and take my power. And then if you're on the other side in an organization, you're trying to herd the cats, it can get really tricky. And so that's the angle that I kind of want to address here. From the years I've been working with culture efforts in companies, I do know this for sure, that empowering people to learn is the key to taking risks, to grow and change. So as people are encouraged to take risks to grow and change, the organization expands its capacity to grow and change. And that maybe seems a truly obvious thing to say, but I felt it's really important to say it because it is a direct relationship. As Jim said earlier, we can't stand still any longer. And it's really important that we understand the relationship of how empowerment actually works without it being this turn everybody loose to just feel powerful in the workplace. And there's a culture assessment tool I've been using for years, and it benchmarks culture factors that closely relate to 7 ROI measures in business, and empowerment is one of those 12 factors. So there's just a whole lot of evidence to support that empowering people is good for business. But here's where it gets a bit tricky, and I am going to get into this slide in just a minute. First, almost all managers and leaders, they have been burned or let down by delegating or empowering someone who didn't follow through as promised, or couldn't because they, as Cindy said, just didn't have the right skills. And that ends up being a fear on the part of a lot of managers. I can't afford to have my task or my project bungled. It was a grand failure. And there ends up being somewhat of this trust issue where most managers I've worked with have said something directly like, I empower the people who I know will follow through. And that ends up being the high achievers. And, you know, in a lot of companies, there's that 10 to 20% go-to people who you know you can count on, and they're shouldering the lion's share of the workload in teams and companies. So I do see that dynamic playing out quite a bit. I think empowerment is a cultivated process, and it takes a lot of patience to find out each person's triggers and strengths and what will help them rise. So I wanted to also just mention that empowerment is a self-driven process. First and foremost. So what I mean is that everybody wants to feel and be empowered, but often there is this belief in the workplace that the managers have the power to do that for us and that we need permission somehow. So when you create structure and an organized process within the culture so that everyone can feel empowered, it's going to work to the extent that they feel it's already true in their own lives. So I just wanted to emphasize that you can't give someone that feeling of being empowered. So anyway, so that being said, there are some good foundational elements to choosing when, who, and how to empower someone in the context of real work. And again, this is more on the job learning perspective than it is formal learning. I'm a huge believer in learning on the job. You know, the up and coming generation, the YouTube generation, they want that micro-learning kind of process. They want that relationship-driven process. And it's going to be really important that organizations can provide that as well. So why is empowerment so important? I think mentoring is a huge piece of what's needed in organizations. The culture work that I'm doing, I'm seeing a lot of organizations trying to figure out how to set up formal and informal mentoring to connect multi-generations and to grow that appreciation of diversity. It is absolutely what allows a company, as I said, to adapt and change more quickly to external forces. So if you're in a lot of the work I'm doing is helping leaders drive decision-making to the front lines of the business, and that is where you're going to get that power to adapt to the external forces, is those people who are related and front-facing to your customer. And it also is how you foster engagement and trust between leaders and employees. So that's why I think the whole concept of empowering people, not just empowering them to take training classes necessarily as the only means of empowerment, but empowering, period. And there are three elements that I talk about a lot in my work as being this confluence of how empowerment actually takes place in a relationship. And that is the sweet spot between the skill that the manager has in knowing how to coach and develop the employee to ensure that they succeed and learn new skills, but also the skill of the employee and the willingness to learn. And I feel like I see so much more energy around that with the younger generation in particular. It doesn't mean that those of us who are in our 50s and so on are not willing to learn. It just means that there's an eagerness for learning. And I think it's really about finding those ways, as Cindy said, to connect it to what the organization needs you to be doing. The clarity is super important. This probably goes without saying, and everybody who's on this call understands about the expectations and goals, the resources, the process. You have to have this clarity, and that is not always an easy thing to get to. But the clarity in my experience that works the best is when it's not just a dry kind of, here's the goal and here's the deliverables and here's, you know, the resources that you have, but it's this dynamic, alive process of connecting people to the bigger mission and purpose of the organization. So when I think about empowering people, it's always about connecting them to the emotional reasons to give them a little bit of a step or challenge. And then trust is a huge piece in terms of it can't be a one-way street. It can't be that the manager trusts the employee, lets go, and runs the other, just drops the thing. There has to be this feeling of the employee accepting the willingness to be trustworthy, as well as the manager extending trust, but in a way that is a relationship-based trust, in the sense that we're going to check in and we're going to be honest and we're going to say I'm stuck and we're going to say how did that happen and what did you learn, so that there is this relationship that goes on to increase this trust. So I believe these three elements are super important. When you empower people for a task or a project, that you should be mindful of all three of these in the business context as to how those are playing out. And I do believe every manager and anybody who's in a management or leadership position should have a small group of people they're empowering actively to learn new skills and rise to new challenges. And as Cindy said, I don't work necessarily in my work with the side of it that is about the formalization of that process as much as I'm teaching the skills of, if you're in a relationship with an employee at any level in the organization, where are you helping them raise the bar to take new challenges on? So that's the perspective I bring. And then lastly, I just wanted to offer this step-by-step process, and I'm happy to, as Nicole's offered, post these slides up if anybody wants them. The first step is to identify between 1 and 5 people who report to you. It can be 2 or 3 or whatever you feel you've got some time for, and then assess what is their readiness for that next sort of level of challenge. Is it a big jump that they're ready for? Is it a small step that they're ready for? But really looking at, hey, I really want to give these 3 people on my team a challenge, and scale of 1 to 5, how big is the challenge that I think they're ready for, as well as what are the behaviors that let me know that. So what specific behaviors do they need to do more of or less of in order to be able to rise to this challenge? And then identifying what are the tasks or projects that I could transition to them that would increase their responsibility, develop their abilities with coaching and feedback. So often what I see is that there's this lack of a regular check-in process for the person, and that seems to be the key. So even if it's a 15-minute weekly check-in or whatever the frequency is, depending on the timing of the project, a lot of times I see that it's sink or swim, where an employee is given, this one swimming lesson and thrown in the water hoping they'll make it. So it is a process to mentor and develop someone, as you all know, and it's not a one-time handoff or necessarily a training class, although those are all great ways to get the learning process in place. I think we as organizations really need to look at building the culture around this theme of empowerment, which is a human desire. It's a fundamental human desire and motivation. And then look at how do we reinvent the ways of doing it and create shorter, more quick learning experiences for people, because that is what the younger generations respond to. So it's my offering and spiel on the topic of empowerment, and thanks for listening. I hope it's been useful to hear some of those thoughts and ideas.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So now we're open for Q&A. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A box, and we'll address each question as it comes in. Love that you each touched on the individual development plans. And one of the things that I've been reading a lot about is how companies, and Arby's actually just posted some information on how they have encouraged the learning culture that they have, and how it starts from the point of enrollment or onboarding. How often are you seeing that within your organizations or other organizations you've worked with as part of that foundation, starting it right from that very, very beginning of that employee's experience with the company?
Well, I'll jump in on this. I know that for us, we are trying to get better at that. We're trying to identify, again, based off of those IDPs that we have, what do we need to do when we bring them in? And the thing that I think most people are good at is, here's your computer, here's how you get into this, here's your software, travel software that we use. But we're not so good, because we have a lot of remote employees that are apart from their managers. We're not so good about bringing in, well, here's what our company stands for. Let me help you with this. Let's see the big picture. So we're starting to try to bring all that into the onboarding process. But again, I think it's one of those things where you start and take baby steps and then figure out what went right and what went wrong. But so I'd say we're about 10% there.
Jim, do you have anything to share on that?
Well, on the, I guess with the organization I'm with today, and I guess I'll put it in that kind of context, the first couple of months are pretty structured in terms of what they go through. Our entry points typically are frontline kinds of jobs, working with members in the credit union world. It's a member, not a customer. But They are pretty structured in our training. Folks that work for me are doing kind of the technical or knowledge training, and then they are working with them not just in the classroom, but also very specifically out in the branches with people who help them in terms of that piece. So I would say the first couple of months, again, it depends upon the job, can be up to 3, are pretty well structured. And then we've got other elements that on a quarterly basis, quite frankly, everybody in the credit union has a certain number of courses. These are online that we have to take, and some of those are just pure compliance courses. But we have the opportunity to add other knowledge kinds of courses as well. I think what we, at least again in the world I'm in today, the experience is we're not bad at doing individual development plans. We tend to time around the same time we're doing performance appraisals. But what I guess historically has happened is the people aren't always following up and following through in terms of what is I guess set up to be done. And that's where I think I have some work, or we have some work to do here as it relates to making sure people again get back to that accountability and understanding who's responsible for your career. Because if you don't hand it to them, or you don't take them out of the location for a period of time, or whatever the case may be, I'm not seeing that people, and I'm overgeneralizing, but not everybody is taking the ownership that they need to develop themselves along the way. And I think we have some work to do in that regard.
I think you touched on a really important point. One of the things that I read, according to Gallup, 70% of U.S. workers are not engaged. Do you think that that's because of it? When you talk about accountability, is that accountability at the employee level, or is it across various levels in the organizations? And maybe Lisa can talk more from a culture perspective, but from the leadership, the middle managers, as well as down to the employee level.
Well, I believe, and I will take that, just that cue. I think that the value around empowerment, whether you use that word or not, is a core value that needs to be set in motion in an organization if you want to empower people to learn. So if it's not stated directly in your core values, and that starts at the top of the organization, the accountability for the CEO and his or her team to demonstrate that and to show that they're willing to push decision-making down throughout the company. I think that's a huge piece of solving the engagement puzzle you spoke about with Gallup. And that's been, by the way, that statistic has been true for about 14, 15 years. It has not changed substantially. And it's even lower when you look at global numbers. So while that may be a big picture answer, I think it's very, very important that, as I said early before, that each person has to feel empowered in their life, right? And that I think that organizational life, since 1950s has not been about that. It's been like you empower yourself outside work, right? And so it's going to take some practice and some true intention in terms of an organizational culture and the leadership of the culture to demonstrate what empowerment looks like. And the learning journey piece of it, you can lead the horse to water, but it's very difficult to force it upon people. So I think it ends up becoming the accountability becomes, every single person who's in a management role is there because they are actively working on empowering people that report to them. I do think that's the key, that accountability has to be, if we promote you into management, we expect you to be developing the next level of leaders.
And if I can add on to that, Lisa, I loved what you said earlier about the micro-learning. I think that also will help us get more people engaged, because I know for us, we've limited all of our training to 1 or 2 hours tops if they're going to be in a classroom, whether that be remote or whether that be in a physical classroom, because people, even if they like development and they want to learn something new, they still have all of their old tasks. So if you're already not engaged, and now I'm adding another task that's going to make you stay late, unless it's super engaging and short, you're not going to want to be there. So I think the fact that we have the technology now to do these micro learning bursts and then tie them together in that development overall, hopefully is going to help us target those individuals that aren't engaged and get them more engaged.
Cindy, can I ask you a question about that? Because you're internally, and Jim too, and also Nicole, since you work in the space. But I'm really curious about that. Because I think that there is a still value in the immersion of a learning experience. Jim, you spoke about this, the 1 week, training universities that Xerox and GE used to have, and GE still has Crotonville, where you go off and you spend a week. And I was in the Crotonville facility in 2016, and I got to feel the power of people coming into that environment and immersing themselves in a true learning experience. So do we think that's going by the wayside completely? Because I'm very curious to know about, if I get it, I provide a lot of, small, short training bites, but I get a lot more pushback than 5 years ago on anything that's more than a half a day. So I'm just kind of curious about the tension or dynamic between those two things.
I think it's less and less, but I think that part of the failure of that, at least from my perspective, and I can think of a corporation many, many years ago where, they sent everybody away, all the leaders, for a week. It was the sheep dip, and you think everything's going to change when you come back. And the problem is when we do that is we don't set the right expectation always up front, and then we don't hold people accountable when they come back as it relates to change. So they come back to the same kind of environment, the same kind of reinforcement. And then therefore organizations, I don't always feel like they're getting the return on investment, that they should get. And I think we can overcome that, but I think we've done it to ourselves to some extent.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to apologize to everyone. We're running kind of long, but I also want to share on that. One of the things that I've noticed is, especially because time is so important and expensive, more so I think now, to take that out of a work day, and also from attention span perspective, one of the things I encourage with the partners that I work with is to take those learning immersions, still bring that in, but maybe make it shorter. So when you talked about 2 hours, that's awesome. Like a 2 to 4 hour, more of a half day kind of concept. And bringing them together could be through the use of technology, something like this, where it's a webinar or coming together directly, but they're able to share that experience, but then support it with those bursts or those micro-learning concepts that, they learn something new, and then they come together and talk about it and share and show how that applies to their on-the-job learning. So it kind of ties it all together as a big component, if that makes sense for everyone.
Yeah, I think the blended concept is probably one of the better models on a lot of things.
Well, we have run over, and I don't want to take too much more of everyone's time, but I want to give each panelist a chance to kind of share any final thoughts based on our conversation today, and after hearing each other share your perspectives.
Well, I'll just start out. Everybody kind of made different points and some similarities across the way, but again, I think it's a critical element, I think, for all of us to pay attention to. I think the leadership in the organization, as was stated before, when you start to talk about the values and what does the organization value and what is our culture and what do we want it to be, it has to start at the top if you're going to have the time and the resources and the inclination to make sure that everybody is growing. And if we set that stage right, then we got to get it down to the individual level and make sure that they truly understand their role in all of that. And I think we got a better chance for success in terms of moving the ball forward on the whole learning side.
And I think that, thank you for saying that, Jim, because I do think that environment of empowerment is a conscious and cultivated environment, and that people who thrive in taking personal initiative in an organization are going to gravitate to environments that have cultivated that kind of environment. So I do look always at the bigger picture of how well are you personally empowering yourself as a manager or a leader in the organization. First and foremost, as the extension, you can't teach what you have not embodied in your own life. And so turns out, just to me, the punchline is just to be always mindful of, in the learning context, what are you learning? And we talk about in the leadership culture work that I do. I often, when I'm working with executives, I talk about, this culture change that you want to go through. You've got to go first. You can't be on the outside, but you can't live on the inside. So, I do think that turns out to be a super important piece of the learning journey, is that everybody in the organization is humbling themselves a bit, or being vulnerable or authentic, or whatever words you want to use, around the learning journey, and that it be something that is embraced as a core value, rather than expecting it to all come from the HR department or the learning department in terms of a program.
And that's a perfect segue for me, Lisa, is the fact that as learning professionals, I think historically we viewed things as we were teaching people subjects. We really have to make, and Jim said the same thing, we really have to empower our managers and our employees to understand that they are the ones moving the process along. We're there to help and support them, but they're the ones that have to do the work that I talked about. And I think there's a lot of really fun tools. We see all the video stuff. We see all the short microlearning. We see the people are like, well, that's what is making this happen. That's not true. The tools are helping us to be able to touch more people, touch them quicker, spread kind of good practices and that type of thing. But it's not the tools. It's us making sure that individuals understand what their internal responsibilities are, and also helping those managers understand that this is a process that they have to be involved in, and it's not just the training department that's going to fix their employees or give them the skills that they need. But they're the integral person, because that's where the majority of the learning takes place, is in their office, not in our class.
Well said.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for each of our panelists for taking the time today to share their perspectives on empowering employees to learn, and invite all of you to join into the conversation in September. We're going to talk about diversity and inclusion.